Good morning, everybody. We will be doing some reading today. So what I wanted to do was, give you the option to follow along and listen to a reading passage that we're going to be doing. You can certainly read it on your own, but I wanted to post it to give you the option if you preferred to read along rather than listening to it on the audio feature of Cami. So here we go. On Google Classroom, if you'd open up the assignment Slavery, No Freedom, No Rights, go ahead and open up the readings, and feel free to pause where you need to. Here we go. Slavery, no freedom, no rights. For sale, human beings. It's too awful to seem real, but it was. From the earliest days of the American colonies through the mid-1860s, nearly 250 years, many American families owned slaves. A slave is a person who is held as the property of another person. Slaves in America were human beings taken from Africa. They were bought and sold the same way horses and wagons were bought and sold. Slaves were given no legal rights. They had to do whatever their slave owners told them to do, and many suffered at the hands of brutal owners. All slaves, no matter how they were treated, suffered because they had no freedom. In 1808, Congress made it illegal to bring any more people from Africa to be slaves, but slavery continued for those already here and their children. Next section. Why would anyone own slaves? That's easy. There was hard work to be done, and lots of it. Slaves received no pay for their work, so they were a form of cheap labor. A slave owner only had to invest whatever money it took to keep the slaves alive. Slavery was the practice of owning human beings. It developed mainly in the southern colonies, where huge plantations of tobacco, cotton, and rice required lots of workers. Plantation owners used slaves for farm labor and household help. In southern cities, slaves did all kinds of jobs that involved physical labor. In the northern colonies, slavery did not become as widespread because people made a living on smaller farms or by trading or manufacturing goods. Even so, plenty of smaller households in both the North and South had one or two slaves that they used as servants. So just take a minute to kind of look at some of the text features on this particular page. Here you see a poster flyer that you would find circulating, especially in the South, of something that might be posted on the side of a building, or flyers you might get walking on the streets, but it says to be sold and let. So where you could purchase slaves. Here you have a picture of famous Harriet Tubman with freed slaves that she helped along the Underground Railroad, which we're going to discuss on Wednesday. Here you see the outside of slave auction. And here you see some horrific scars that unfortunately commonly slaves would be beaten. So it shows the horrific reality. All right, next section. How was slavery defended? People defended slavery in one of two ways. Some people thought slavery was a necessary evil, something we needed even though we didn't like it. Others thought slavery was actually a good thing that helped everyone involved. Here are 4 ways people justified slavery. And this is actually going to lead us into an activity during our lesson today, during class. So here's a few examples of pro-slavery thinking, meaning the way that people who own slaves justified why slavery was necessary. Don't make me do that. We have to have slaves, so there's someone to do the yucky work nobody else wants to do. Okay, so that's one way that they would justify, well, nobody wants to do these unpleasant jobs. It maybe it's, cleaning up human waste or something, cleaning up after, animals. So that was one way to justify, well, if, we don't have slaves to do them, maybe we'll have to do it. No pain, no gain would be another kind of pro-slavery thinking. We believe slavery in America is teaching Africans to be better people, which will be good for them in the long run. Pretty grotesque thought. Tiger by the tail. We want to let the slaves go, but we're afraid of what will happen if we do, so we won't. So they feel that keeping them in slavery or enslaved will keep them under control and fear of revolts, which we will find out again in this week's lessons that was becomes more and more common. And then the last example, for their own good. We think Black people are so inferior that keeping them enslaved actually helps them. And I think, just to point, these four different kind of examples of the way that some, pro slavery people justified slavery. This was, how they felt keeping slaves was necessary in protecting their way of life, especially in these southern plantations, where these plantation owners were incredibly wealthy, and this is what they kind of felt was acceptable, which, as we know, was absolutely deplorable. All right, next page. Here we go. Slavery, no freedom, no rights. Freedom and equality, but not for all. The United States was founded on liberty and equality, but to early Americans, these principles had to do with establishing a government ruled by citizens instead of a king. The first Americans didn't even believe all citizens should have a say in government, just those who were white, male, and owned land. The U.S. Constitution was written to ensure liberty and equality, yet it also allowed slavery, even though many early Americans thought slavery was wrong. The South had relied on slave labor for a very long time. Those states would never have voted to approve the Constitution if slavery was outlawed. So, if we were to go back when we were learning about the development of the Constitution, we know that many compromises had to be made in order to finally ratify or approve and ratify the Constitution. So if you look over here to the right, here's just kind of a refresh of some of those constitutional compromises made. When the Constitution was adopted, it said this. So first bullet, Congress had to wait until 1808, 20 years, before passing a law to make it illegal to import slaves into the United States. So although 20 years after the Constitution was adopted, ratified, and becomes the new government of the new nation, 20 years in the making, we still unfortunately had illegal slave trading going on across the Atlantic Ocean. If you remember the Middle Passage and learning about that. So this continues to be a huge issue, and leads to just a bigger rift or divide in the nation as this illegal activity goes on. Next bullet says slaves who escaped to a state where slavery was illegal did not become free. If their owners claimed them, they had to be returned. So we're going to learn about the Fugitive Slave Act. So a law was passed where runaway slaves had to be returned even if they ran away to a state where slavery was illegal. For example, let's say a slave escaped from Virginia and made his way to New York where slavery was illegal. Under this new Fugitive Slave Act, they would have to be returned. And if someone, helped the slave or hid the slave or didn't return the slave, that person would be faced with consequences. It might be a fine. It might be they were put in jail. And then the last bullet here, to calculate a state's population, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. Population determined how many representatives a state got in Congress. So if you remember when we learned about the Great Compromise and how southern and northern states had very different populations, we know northern states were more heavily populated. Southern states wanted to start counting 3/5 of a slave as a person to help increase their population so that they had more representation. Quick quote down here, if you can see where my mouse is. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776. A couple more sections here. Friends of Freedom. So now we're going to see the abolition movement begin, where many more people are seeing the absolute evils in slavery and how it is just so inhumane. And we're going to see a big shift in the thinking of the United States, and obviously a huge cause leading to the Civil War. So here we go. Friends of Freedom. Many people in the United States oppose slavery. Abolitionists were people who wanted slavery ended permanently or abolished. So there's one of our vocab words. Most abolitionists lived in the northern states where slavery wasn't as popular, but some Southerners were abolitionists too. Abolitionists put pressure on politicians to end slavery, and they worked to convince society that slavery was morally wrong. They did this by forming groups, holding conventions, giving speeches and sermons, handing out pamphlets, and even publishing newspapers and songs. And here you see a Boston abolitionist. His name was Wendell Phillips in 1851. And these were very common, especially in the north states and the northeastern states and bigger cities. But you would see these kind of assemblies or rallies and speaking out against slavery. And we call these people abolitionists. A deadly revolt. One Virginia night in 1831, Nat Turner and several other slaves crept into the house where their owner slept and murdered the entire family. Then they went to other houses and killed even more white people. More slaves joined Turner, and they killed at least 55 people before they were stopped. Turner and many others were executed for these murders, and angry white mobs murdered nearly 200 black people afterward. People blamed Turner's rebellion partly on his education. Virginia responded by passing a law making it illegal to teach black people to read and write. And this is for a historical document, primary document of the massacre that took place, led by Nat Turner. Don't like it? Sue me. Another slave, Dred Scott, took a different approach. Scott's owner moved often and took Scott with him to each new residence. Because of that, Scott had lived in both free and slave states. In 1846, he sued for his freedom. He argued that because his owner had taken him to live where slavery was illegal, he should be free. Scott's case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but he didn't win. In the Dred Scott decision, I'm going to start the last sentence over. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled black people were not citizens and had no right to sue in the first place. And there's a picture of Dred Scott. So we're seeing different approaches to slaves standing up to slavery. We see, riots, so a more violent approach, and then we see, people, so like Nat Turner, obviously, and then we see people like Dred Scott who took an approach of trying to stand up for his rights in a more, obviously, a non-violent, more diplomatic way or approach. So we in class today, like I said, we're going to work on some activities, but I wanted to at least have this read ahead for you guys so that you can either read it yourself if that's what you prefer. You can certainly listen to it on that audio on Cami. It's just a little bit robotic, so that's why I wanted to offer reading and discussing it available to you as well. I hope everyone's having a good morning, and I will see you in a little bit.